So what I'm going to talk about right now is the integration of N-of-1 trials in the usual care and into the healthcare ecosystem. Next slide, please. And so my objectives for this talk are, one, to review the N-of-1 trial approach and how it might be integrated in the usual care, which is what we are doing here at Tufts Medical Center and Tufts Medicine, but also to get input from PBRN members about how the N-of-1 approach might best work in practices and under what kinds of conditions. Next slide, please. So a little background about clinical trials. The traditional kinds of trials we're all used to hearing about, which are done for FDA, are called efficacy trials. And in evaluating a new treatment, detailed efficacy trials are used to assess impact in optimally selected patients.
All right, I'll be back. Thank you.
And these efficacy trials are typically conducted over short periods of time for FDA approval and subsequent marketing. So, for example, when you look at a label on Prilosec, it'll always say, well, if you're going to use this more than 6 to 8 weeks, ask your doctor. Well, that's not because they really care. It's just that the initial trial only went that long. And so that's what an efficacy trial is. Moreover, efficacy trials typically have about 5 to 10% of all eligible patients, so they're not particularly generalizable to usual practice. Next slide. Effectiveness trials are different. The idea of effectiveness trials is to understand the likely impact of new treatments when they're used in typical clinical care. Efficacy trials should be supplanted or supplemented, I would say, by effectiveness trials. Effectiveness trials test treatments under usual practice conditions across the spectrum of patients for whom they will ultimately be used, with follow-up that much more closely matches the long durations that patients typically take medications. Next slide. So, unfortunately, follow-up effectiveness trials are infrequently done. And when they are, they're typically done years after the efficacy trial. And there's lots of reasons for that. The most obvious one is there's no financial incentive for a pharmaceutical company to do another trial in a more heterogeneous sample when they already have approval. But anyway, we've explored a lot of different effectiveness trial approaches, including a model we call E to E trials, which are efficacy to effectiveness trials, and efficacy and effectiveness trials. But these all address the delays and inefficiencies from having separate efficacy and effectiveness trials. I'm not talking about those today, though. Today, we want to address a different way to address facilitating assessment of real-world effectiveness in single individuals, and that is the N-of-1 trial. Thank you. Again, I apologize for my voice. If I could only figure out a way to make it work better, I would. In usual clinical care, when we take care of our patients, it's very common for us to try a medication for a period of time to learn how well it works for a given patient to inform treatment. We all know that some medicines work better for one patient than another, and it's not just the average result that we see in a clinical trial that informs our care for every single patient. This approach, of course, is patient-centric, and it reinforces the patient-physician shared decision-making process about treatments. In a structured version of this process, N-of-1 trials, individual patients are given candidate treatments which may include placebo in alternating periods, ideally doubly blinded, to decide which treatment is best for that patient. Thereby, N-of-1 trials combine foundational parts of usual clinical practice and of clinical research methods to determine what is the most effective treatment for a particular patient. Next slide. Classically, N-of-1 trials have been most suitable for chronic conditions that are stable during the periods of times in which the patient is given candidate treatments and clinical comparisons are made. We call these type 1 N-of-1 trials. Alternating periods of treatments in an N-of-1 trial are not appropriate for rapidly progressing conditions, as the underlying baseline would be changing as the trajectory of the illness changes. It wouldn't make comparisons reasonable. Also, in rapidly deteriorating conditions, such experimentation might not be justified given the risks and the time required to test multiple treatments. So far, following this, you should interrupt me at any time if this isn't clear. By supporting personalized evidence-based decision-making as
Hey,
part of,
Harry,
yes.
why is it on the previous slide uh, that when things are that it's not justified given the risks and time? I mean, if you don't know what to do, how are you justified in not studying it?
Well, I might give you an answer in a couple of slides when I talk about type 2 N-of-1 trials. But the point is, first of all, if you're going back and forth, treatment A, treatment B, treatment C, treatment A, you're going back and forth, and it's relatively stable, say like heart failure or hypertension or insomnia. If there's a steady baseline, then you can make valid comparisons. If somebody is deteriorating rapidly, first of all, the comparisons won't be reasonable because the baseline is changing. But also, if they have a rapidly deteriorating condition, now if you don't know what to do, then I suppose such experimentation, whether explicit or implicit, is reasonable. I mean, that's kind of what we do in cancer trials, I'm afraid. But I wouldn't explicitly say, oh, let's see whether this a statin or that a statin is better for you for your muscle pain if your problem is rapidly progressing. I don't know if that helps, Ben.
Thank you.
When you get to the type 2 trials, it might make more sense too. Anyway, so by supporting personalized evidence-based decision making as part of usual clinical care, N-of-1 trials are, in a sense, an example of effectiveness trials. And also because they compare alternative treatments, they also can be considered comparative effectiveness. And also because they're customized to a single patient, they also are the epitome of patient-centered research. Those of you who are interested in PCORI know those are all catchphrases for them. They also meet some unmet needs. First of all, they are a way to systematically collect clinically relevant data, symptoms, signs, and markers of disease activities, which are collected by the patients, by clinicians, and others involved with care. So, for example, an N-of-1 trial in children can often include therapists, family members, and so forth. Also, there's structured evidence to support patient-centered informed decision-making, thereby those who really require a high-cost treatment will get them because the evidence will be there, and those who do just as well or better on less expensive treatments can get their most appropriate therapy. And that has to do with stakeholders, as I'll talk in a bit. Also, you can get generalizable data about treatment effects in that you can take data from multiple N-of-1 trials using the same protocols and combine them as a multi-participant crossover trial to provide generalizable aggregated data on comparative effectiveness of treatments on which patients will benefit from which treatment. So if you give the same, and I'll talk a little bit about this perhaps later, for example, we did a multiple N-of-1 trials for fibromyalgia comparing a couple antidepressants. And we used the same protocol for every single patient. And then each person got what was best for them, but we also could combine them together and use those as a larger crossover clinical trial. Next slide. So I'm going to just talk a little bit about the type 1 and type 2. Traditional type 1 N-of-1 trials are, as I already indicated, suitable for chronic conditions that are stable during the period in which the patient is receiving candidate treatments. In contrast, N-of-1 trials are generally not considered appropriate for rapidly progressive conditions, as I mentioned, because the disease trajectory would confound comparisons. But you could consider just a single treatment type 2 N-of-1 trial, and I'll go into that. Next slide. So here's the difference between type 1 and type 2. And I say this in part because about a year or so ago, FDA released guidance on what they called N-of-1 trials. Excuse me. And they said, if you if you have a special custom-made disease treatment for rare or ultra rare disease, and you use it on, and you have biological markers, you could use it, just put together the results of a number of patients who have the same disease and use the same treatment without ever doing any comparison. So if you see in the far left column, type 1 are again in chronic conditions, whereas type 2 ones are not necessarily chronic or stable, but mainly for which there are no accepted treatments. So you can't just use already approved treatments or at least off-label approved treatments, but you have to try something new for a targeted disease, for targeted treatment for a special disease. And for example, a patient with a specific mutation. For example, some approval was gotten about a year or two ago for a cystic fibrosis treatment, which was targeted as special genetic variant. It's a very rare type of it, but they gave it to about 12 or 13 patients. It worked, and that was approved. And I won't go into more details here, but I will tell you that it's conceivable that in a PBRN, not only might you use this for your own practice to do type 1 trials, but it might be that if there's a rare disease that comes up, a type 2 trial might be also of interest. And we were approached recently by some people in rural areas for using this in cancer. Whether or not that's appropriate or will be workable, I'm not sure in a rural setting, but we'll find out. Next slide. Here's this showing you this graphically. A type 1 trial, basically you give them treatment A, then there's a washout period, treatment B, washout, C, then you might change the order just to get a second shot at each treatment, then C, B, and A. And you do endpoint assessments along the way, as you can see. Whereas for a type 2 trial, you just give one personalized treatment, and then after that, you look at the clinical data, the biomarkers, and you make a decision about if it's effective. Next slide. Also, as I mentioned, you can aggregate N-of-1 trials. So for example, if you across a practice network decided you would all take a look at, well, say fibromyalgia is the example I'm using here, and you want to compare, say, fluoxetine with amitriptyline, you could each do that for each individual patient, give them the treatment they like best, but you could also aggregate it together and publish it as a clinical trial. I have to say that although I've talked to people at FDA, and they would take such a trial as evidence for them for efficacy for an approval, they've not seen it done. And I suppose the reason for that is it's more expensive than a traditional two-arm trial. But it is considered a legitimate way to compare treatments over larger numbers as well. And thereby, individual patients get the optimal care, and the medical community gets generalizable evidence about the efficacy and safety of a treatment. Next slide. So the question is, though, will this be used? It turns out that N-of-1 trials should reduce speculation and biases intrinsic to usual care. However, they're not widely used. In fact, the only times I could see them being used is when they're supported by research grants. And they've been around for 3 or 4 decades. They've been used, there's a group in Canada that's done quite a bit of it. There's others in the United States and around the country that have done it, and PCORI supported a little bit of it. But they're always supported by grants. And what I felt was needed was a business model of N-of-1 trials that would generate value for key stakeholders that would support the wide use of N-of-1 trials in clinical care. And so we're trying to build out that N-of-1 trial capacity here at Tufts Medicine and for wider dissemination. What we realized, though, is to be useful and sustainable, we needed there to be benefits to all stakeholders in the healthcare ecosystem, to patients, clinicians, healthcare systems, insurance payers, and pharmaceutical companies. Next slide, please. Let me just say a little bit about what I mean by delivering value to all members. So for example, I'm sure those of you who are taking care of patients have had the fun of putting in prior approvals to get a drug approved so your patient can get it, even though it seems self-evident that they should get it. And that's quite a process. It turns out that causes a lot of time wasting. It's annoying for the patient, for the clinician, for the office. And it turns out it doesn't make insurance companies or pharmaceuticals popular either. So we went to pharmaceutical companies and also to payers and asked the question, could we actually get their collaboration in doing that? And that's basically what we're trying to do. We now have some insurers here in the Boston area who have agreed to allow us to do N-of-1 trials, and then the patient will get whatever is best for them based on the N-of-1 trials. And they will know it won't require a prior approval. They'll just get that drug. Now, we're doing those in pilot studies because you can imagine they don't want to open up the floodgates. But there are some data that suggest that if you do that, it's not always the most expensive drug or the one advertised most on TV that gets used, but rather the one that's best for the patient. And so we're doing that pilot study now to determine how well that works, and including the economics of it. So what now we're doing is running this pilot trial here at Tufts Clinical and Translational Science Institute. And this isn't just testing the execution of the trials for supporting clinical decision, but it's also testing it. How can we get the entire ecosystem, including payers, involved? And so it's not just a research, clinical research study, it's a pilot's policy study. And we're using it now for type 1 trials for chronic conditions with slow progression, starting with rheumatoid arthritis and asthma. Next slide. So we started out, first of all, by getting multiple stakeholders involved, because if we really believe ourselves that we want to have all stakeholders benefit from this, we have to start asking them about it. So a couple of years ago, starting with patients, patient groups, clinicians, healthcare system, payers, pharmaceutical manufacturers, regulators, and others, we started asking them what they saw as being the benefits of this approach. And then we're also creating the capacity to run these trials here at Tufts CTSI that we can use across Tufts Medicine, including embedding it in specialty clinics. And we're building standardized processes, procedures, and operations to allow us to execute N-of-1 trials and also disseminate. Next slide. They will be enrolled and treated with a sequence of already approved therapeutic agents. And the primary objectives are to generate patient-specific evidence about the effects of the therapeutic agents on their symptoms, disease activity to inform treatment decisions, to demonstrate the value of N-of-1 trials in usual care and improving care and providing value to all stakeholders, and also to understand the cost implications of this approach. Because if it worked and it made access to the right drug better and it didn't cause major cost implications, it would be obviously attractive and would be an attractive part of usual care. And then as a secondary objective, yes, we can aggregate these multiple trials to publish trials on the overall effects of these agents. Next slide. So we're starting with rheumatoid arthritis with a TNF inhibitor, two TNF inhibitors, a JAK inhibitor, and an IL-6 inhibitor. These are the drugs you usually see advertised on TV. They're expensive, and yet the payers were remarkably interested in doing this, partly because they said, you know, these are expensive drugs, but Harry, I'm really worried about the $1 million drugs now, so this is okay. So we'll see how they feel at the end of our pilot trial, but we're doing a pilot trial now to see how that goes. Next slide. Our analytics is that we're looking at each individual's outcomes, and then we're also looking at models for aggregating the data. And the endpoints are being collected through a secure web application, including patient-based outcomes, using the usual kinds of tools that are used in rheumatoid arthritis. We're using Bayesian analysis to express the results probabilistically. Here's the probability that this biologic is superior to that biologic. And we're also, for those of you who treat rheumatoid arthritis, you know you can't use a medication for a month or two and then stop it and get to a baseline, because that would be unethical. So what we're doing is we're starting them on the new drug, but we use a month of washout where we analytically, we don't use those data. And then we start with the next several months of that treatment period. Next slide. And the results will be provided graphically to see how their function is reflected on the scales. This is just an example of that. Next slide. And then we have a schedule of events. We don't want to have people have to come into the office all the time for this. So we have a remote data collection system so that we can do telemedicine visits with them on a monthly basis. And every other month they come into the rheumatoid arthritis clinic. That's how we're doing it here. It could be customized for other places. We have what we call our clinical trial in a box, which we developed during COVID for doing care in not having to come downtown, partly because we didn't want people with COVID contaminating others, but also this means it can be used in disadvantaged settings, in rural settings, where people might not have the time or opportunity to come into a medical center. And we think this is important for settings such as your PBRN may have. Next slide. So we're also doing this for asthma, starting right after starting our rheumatoid arthritis one, after following the usual steps, step 1 and 2 for using usual medications. Then we go to the biologics. Next slide. And these drugs will be used in the same way that we're using them for rheumatoid arthritis. But this will be done in the asthma clinic to start with, and we will help them, but we hope to have it disseminated out into our practice network. Next slide. So where are we going with all this? Again, our primary objective is to generate patient-specific evidence about the effects of therapeutic agents on symptoms and disease activity to inform decisions about the best treatment for every single patient. After all, this is a patient-centric approach. And we want to also, though, demonstrate its value as a primary objective to all stakeholders, because unless it's also valued at clinicians, health systems, and payers, it won't be used commonly. It'll only be relegated to grant support. Next. So we're just now initiating our rheumatoid arthritis trials at Tufts Medical Center, and we're about to start after that the asthma trial. And we're going to continue to evaluate and improve our processes, infrastructures, business arrangements through experience. And we're looking for other settings going forward. Next slide. One thing while we work with the other health systems and stakeholders, it turns out one of our partners for Tufts CTSI is Kaiser Permanente, the practice system nationally. And so we'll be working with them, but we're also looking for other settings where this might be of interest to practitioners and researchers. And we'll continue to engage other stakeholders. So that I'll stop right there and just say this is our 2 to 3 year objective to integrate this into usual care. Next slide. And here are my questions now for you. Plus, that way you won't have to listen to my voice anymore. How might these approaches be applied to practices in your settings? How would the remote trial platform work in your settings? For what kind of conditions would this be most attractive? For chronic conditions, let's say. And although I'm thinking that type 1 trials would be of most interest, maybe there would be interest in type 2 trials. And then any other questions or issues that you would like to raise. And with that, if you want, you can take down the slides.
Thank you so much. I think we're a small enough group that if you just want to unmute, ask questions, raise hands, if we get a lot all at once, that would be great.
Great. I'll start if that's okay, Liz. So, Harry, it's great. I'm a practitioner in Colebrook, New Hampshire. I see patients. Sometimes I use treatments that aren't prescribed. what would be necessary for a formalized N-of-1? For example, do I have to go to the CTR and then get IRB consent to do this? Or can I do what I've done for 20 years in Colebrook, and that is give the treatment and note what I do on my Epic chart?
Right. Well, you can certainly continue doing what you're doing, your Epic chart, to the extent that you can use your Epic chart. No, that's sorry. But if you want to do this in an organized way and you're having patients collect data and you also want to interact with the payer, which I think is a key thing,
Yes.
then I think you want to touch base with your IRB. Your IRB may say this can be waived because you're actually using approved drugs in usual ways for an approved or at least a usual treatment. So let's say you're using statins for someone who's hyperlipidemic. You know, there's nothing you're going to necessarily use that's exciting. However, the reason you want to go formally on this is because you want your payer to approve this, and that means that they have to agree that first of all, they will pay for the care, which they're happy to do, and they'll also pay for the drug, which I think they're willing to try for this pilot, but I think they're willing to do it. And in that case, you also want to the extent you can blind, that's also helpful. And let me stop and talk about that for a moment. We ideally thought we should do double-blinded studies. And one of the reasons, for example, mentioning statins, you may remember about a couple of years ago, there was a hysterical and interesting article in New England Journal of Medicine, I believe, might have been Lancet, but I think it was New England Journal, where somebody did a four-part trial of statins. It was done in England, and they had 4 different periods, each of which were 3 months. It was given to people who only who had muscle pain from their statins, and so they gave them 4 different treatments. One, they gave them the same treatment they had. They also gave them a different statin. They also gave them a placebo, and they also gave them nothing. And that was, they called a nocebo. And what was interesting is the muscle pain was pretty much equivalent in all 3 when they were given a pill, but it was gone when they didn't get anything. And so a placebo was way worse than a nocebo. So that just reminds us all what we know is that the placebo effect is substantial. And when you can use a placebo, that's great. So we went into that planning to do that. But in rheumatoid arthritis, where you have these very fancy injectors,
Yes.
we thought about trying to cover them. We're going to put a toilet paper tube over them and something, but it became ridiculous. And we decided that if we have very assiduous data collection and we use, you know, rigid patient-reported outcomes, we'll do the best we can, but we can't blind those. And we, in some other circumstances, that probably will also be the case with some other biologics in asthma. But there surely are other cases where they could be. You can put, for example, we're thinking of doing one for insomnia where you could put all of the pills in the placebo in a capsule, so they would be indistinguishable. So, but now back to your question, Cliff. You know, because you want to use those procedures and have formal data collection, I think it's best to go by your IRB, and their response would be dependent on, you know, kind of how they saw that.
And Harry, would you recommend that the evaluation include a promise questionnaire so it's more formal?
I would, yes. And one of the things, and Ludovic Trinquart's here, our statistician and methodologist for this study, we're putting together a data collection system with graphic presentations so that it'll facilitate that conversation between the patient and the physician. I think one of the best parts about this is, you know, you and I try different things all the time, but we're rather impressionistic in our decision making about it, I'm afraid. And this would make it a little bit more formal. And I think patients would like it. We know that when we did this for fibromyalgia, patients did appreciate it.
So I mean, I don't want to monopolize, but I think that the real opportunity is in a condition such as long COVID, where we have, you know, a number of different off the cuff sort of treatments that are low risk, but potentially high impact that are out there on the internet. And it would seem to me that this would be a great data collection process for a disorder that nothing works, or at least nothing of the established treatments work, and people are dying for treatment, and they do it themselves sometimes. I mean, some of these people on the internet are taking it themselves.
Yeah, I agree. And also, if we did it in an organized way, then we could aggregate the data together and give information to the general community.
Yeah.
But without compromising individuals' care.
Yeah.
Gary and then Ben.
Okay, first of all, that was very, very informative and actually provided me with some insight into a dimension of clinical investigation that I was minimally aware of before. What I was thinking is that it can be very, very valuable to provide an overview of your approach to the residents and fellows, because I am quite confident that this is something that they are really unaware of. And if we have your permission, since your presentation was recorded, we could very easily go ahead and make it available without any additional input initially on your part. Does that make any sense, Harry?
Well, if they could stand to listen to my voice with a cold, but yes, they are absolutely welcome to listen to it and to look at the slides and so forth, of course.
And we will go
Also-
ahead and,
also-
and we will go ahead and record their response to your voice.
Yeah, they'll probably make them eat lozenges. But anyway, the other thing is the article that I cited on one of those slides has kind of an overview of this approach, which might be of interest as well.
We can go ahead and provide that, as background information as well. Thank you.
Mhm.
First, Harry, that's a very intriguing topic. Thank you. First, you should be aware that the word nocebo has another meaning, which is the opposite of a placebo, something that induces noxious symptoms.
That's right.
So you might need to come up with another phrase.
Yeah, that's what they used in their article, but I agree that it was, yes, point taken.
And the other thing is, you probably don't really want placebos in this business anyway, because you're not trying to find the mechanism of action or whether the active ingredient is the workhorse. You're just trying to figure out what works. And placebos do work, so you don't want to subtract out the placebo effect by any means. You want it to be exactly what will happen when we prescribe the drug for real, which is it'll come with its own placebo profile. Preferably it's a bright red pill or something that amplifies the placebo.
Yeah, I have mixed feelings about that because I basically agree with you. But on the other hand, there's most placebos have less risk than most drugs. And so, and I'll speak from personal experience here, but you'll get the drift. It turns out at some point I found out that ibuprofen raises my blood pressure. So I stopped taking it, and suddenly I had aches and pains every darn where. And so I muddled around, and at one point I decided that if I stopped eating dairy, my pain was less. But you know what? I'm not so sure, and my wife is definitely not so sure. And so I really have thought of, doing a placebo-controlled trial of that. And if it turns out that the placebo was as effective as, as getting rid of the dairy product, then I think I would benefit.
A placebo versus
So what I would do is I would take a little capsule of milk product, and then I would take and if it basically made no difference, then I could stop avoiding ice cream, which would be a life improvement.
Accepting it might not be the same active ingredient. The ice cream might still cause trouble.
That's possibly true.
You should definitely be measuring the adverse effects of whatever you're studying along with the positive effects.
That's right. But I agree with you also, the placebo effect, which was actually described, I guess, by Lou Lasagna, who was our dean for a long time, is a powerful positive effect.
Now, what does the clinical service provide that a Vermont or Maine physician might want or need? What are you guys offering?
Great
Yeah.
question. Great question.
Yeah, okay. Well, first of all, we want the care to be covered ultimately by your payer, which isn't, so we have to talk to your payers. And they'll generally be pretty, I think, easy with it, especially because, the distinction between doing an N-of-1 trial and the usual care is pretty much the same. I mean, you're looking at, say, the cholesterol level, you're looking at the pills, you're looking at, so that's pretty easy. And the drugs, especially if not super expensive, that's pretty easy. And even if they are, it seems to work out. We have this remote platform that we could help deploy in remote settings, if that would be helpful, which allows, which is based on telehealth, which you've probably all partaken in one way or the other. And we also can provide the data infrastructure and help you select data collection items that are appropriate to the condition you're studying. That'd be the kind of thing we would do. We don't have a phalanx team that shows up, at your door, but we would be delighted to work with you. We're at the beginning of this right now, but the objective is to demonstrate that this can be incorporated in the usual care. So you would be serving as frankly a test setting for doing this. So I wish I could say, yes, we've done this for a couple of years and it's working great, but we think we have all the tools to do it. And so it would be a collaborative project.
Who does the telehealth visits?
We've been doing them ourselves from our setting, but in this case, we would probably give you the platform and let the practitioner do that, presumably, and they would bill for that visit, presumably.
Thank you. Jean, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. That was a great talk. And my question is similar to the one that was just asked about insurance. Are you currently, I know you mentioned Kaiser, do you have as sort of an inclusion or exclusion criteria for these? Which I'm assuming you do have some kind of criteria that you want adults or only, some age group, et cetera. And I'm wondering if one of the exclusion criteria tends to be the kind of insurance they have.
Yeah.
Because while you say you can talk to them, I mean, there are a bunch of them out there, and I can't imagine they're all that easy to get a hold of and to get them to agree. My experience with insurance companies is not good.
Yeah, you bring up a couple things. First of all, getting hold of them all, but also the unattractive nature of including people based on their insurance. Not that isn't an American principle of healthcare, but nonetheless, it's not pleasant. What we did here in the Massachusetts area is basically the two biggest healthcare insurers here are Blue Cross and what's called Point 32 now, which is a combination of Tufts Health Plan and Harvard Pilgrim Health Plan. We went to Point 32 and they basically agreed to do it. And we, as well as they, wanted to do a pilot to see how it worked. So that's what we asked for, and that's what we basically gotten them to agree with. That's for rheumatoid arthritis and presumably also asthma. For Blue Cross, it's a little more interesting in the following way. I went to Blue Cross, as they are, in fact, partners of Tufts CTSI, and they said, well, you don't need our approval because you guys are already capitated with us, Tufts Medicine, so just go to your health plan, your health system. And I went to the health system, and the health system was agreeable, but logistically, it was actually complicated, and we're still working that out. And I say that just to be transparent, but also because you make a good point that these arrangements these are new arrangements.
Yeah.
However, it's been pretty easy to get people to listen and agree to it. Massachusetts is, now we also are talking now to the chief medical officer for Medicaid in Massachusetts, which is important and we think is very, is highly relevant. And actually he's also for Medicare for medications. So it's going to be a bit of a, I think the start, it's taking a little bit of work. We hope that once we've shown we've gone through a full trial of this and seen the results, it'll be easier. We also think that the results from patients in terms of their attitudes toward their insurer might be convincing, because I don't have to tell you that you may have heard that the general population is not enamored by health insurers. And if they could do something that seemed more patient-centric, getting the medications they wanted without putting, delaying and all that, I think that would be good. So, but these are early days for us on that, but that's what we're doing.
Thank you.
Go for it, Ben.
Harry, I had another question. Just thinking about implementation of this, we have the PBRN, that we work very closely with. I just wonder if it wouldn't be worthwhile if we had an opportunity to get a broader audience with enthusiasm from some of the practitioners that are out in the field. Beyond us, most of us that come here are more academically oriented. And I just wonder if it isn't worth a venture into the community-based practices a little more carefully.
It is, Cliff, and I think that probably, since they don't have a regularly scheduled seminar or education series, I will bring it up at the next board meeting.
Yes.
I'd be
Yeah.
happy to do that. Maybe my voice would be better. And also, once we have results from, executing our pilots, that'll also be helpful. But also it depends. I very much would like their input about how this seems a natural part of practice,
Yes.
unnatural, and so forth.
Yeah, we have a research echo that we do once a month, Gary. And I mean, Gary and I coordinate it. Meredith is the person who's in charge of it. And Harry, that is another venue that we might consider, where we get people from the VA and there it's a lunchtime thing. So we do get some practitioners there. So that's another opportunity. But
I'd
yeah.
be happy to.
Yeah. I think the question that we would have as a CTR is whether we could be an umbrella for those resources that the practitioners need in collaboration with you. In other words, the CTR would provide the infrastructure support. I think the inherent risk for a primary care doc is they're out there on their own with this, and if something goes wrong, that's trouble. But also, who do I call if I can't get the insurer, or what do I do if there's an adverse event, and what kind of reporting is really necessary in that situation? And that's where I think the CTR might potentially provide some structure. Just thinking aloud, but
Cliff, I completely agree. And you and I have talked in the past about collaborating between our CTSI and CTR, and this would be a great example of when that would be practical and useful. Because for us, doing this from down in Boston would be, I think, a bit too removed. And if you were, if we were collaborating on this and you could help execute it in Northern New England, that would be fantastic.
So that leads me to another question, and sorry again to monopolize, but Harry, is there a training component to N-of-1 that you're doing in Tufts that might, for example, we take a primary care doc and say, look, you can be the point person, but we need you to really be as up to speed as possible, or to be part of the Tufts pilot?
I'd say that we don't have that together now. I think by the time we finish our pilot, which hopefully will be, starting very soon, we ought to be able to do that. I've talked to many people. I've participated in prior N-of-1 trials, and it's actually, very close to usual care. It's just you're being slightly more formal about data collection. So it's intuitive, but I think that's a great point. And if we were going to disseminate it, a training phalanx would be very helpful.
Good. Yeah, I think it's something we could offer the PBRN, and I bet we would get opportunity. I bet we would get candidates from the primary care docs who start the process before you're finished with your pilot, so you know, and they would observe and a potential educational component that could serve us well going down the road.
If I could give them CMEs, I bet that would even.
Yeah, I
help.
know, I know. I was just thinking the same thing here.
But the selling point is probably the pre-authorization hurdle.
Yeah.
So if we're looking at an expensive or any drug that's on, we don't care if it's expensive, but if we have to do the pre-authorization, we'd rather go to the dentist. So if we're going to get a pass on that, that's very attractive. Now, why does the insurance company do that? Presumably because if it doesn't work in the trial, they won't pay for it for that patient. Is that explicit?
Yes, well, let me say it in a positive way. We agree that we will do as best we can blinded objective data collection, and there will be and based on those data, the clinician and the patient will select the preferred treatment, and obviously it would have to be based on data, not based on TV ads, and they are willing to pay for that. Now they're doing this for a trial. For a pilot. So we'll see how long that lasts. However, there's never been a study of the economics of this except for one done, and I believe New Zealand or Australia. I forget which now. It was small, but it actually reduced costs by doing this. Not by a whole lot, but it's something like 14% or something. But the truth is, there's a lot of paperwork and antipathy generated by all this PA stuff. And so they will.
Yeah, but the insurance company, that's their bread and butter. They love the antipathy and the paperwork. So are they committed to saying, look, if the expensive drug is the winner, we'll pay for it for?
Yes, and not only will they pay for it, but they'll pay for it for then on. So
very
even
good.
if the trial is over, yeah, because what they can't do is pay for it for the trial and then say, okay, that was nice, but now we're going back. No, they have to commit to paying for it as long as that patient is a member of their insurance plan.
That may be all you need to sign up docs for this.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you're right about the pre-authorization and the issues around that.
There's almost no issue that annoys doctors, especially, well, I'm sure the specialists too, than pre-authorization.
Yes, I agree.
Megan, go for it.
Thanks. Harry, great talk. It's nice to see you again. My name is Megan Stabler. Just as a reminder, I'm the executive director of the co-op, which is the PBRN in Northern New England. And so just to address some of the comments that I heard, and then also your questions in your presentation of, can this be done? What is the appetite for it? So I just want to weigh in on 2 points of consideration. So can it be done? Yes. And I think what's needed to do that is that we need improved compliance standardization. So I'm really thinking about a larger IRB structure, MOUs, DUAs, and IRBs that accept to facilitate multi-site studies. That's a huge challenge for us right now, and one that we are starting to work with the CTR on. So fingers crossed that a project that's in the pipe gets funded and we have some resources to build that infrastructure, because it's not currently strong enough, I think, to roll out something like that you presented on. Secondly, appetite. I think that I just want to remind folks really some cornerstones of practice-based research. So this is community engaged research in the practice. And so first, we prioritize ground up research. So this is, clinicians come to us with questions, something they're seeing in the practice that they want to investigate. That being said, we also participate, as you know, with top-down research and from academia, and, we're collaborating with clinicians, right? And so that would be most of what the clinical trial world is. And in order to do that, in order to do the top down, we really need to make sure that it's of interest and relevant to the practices and the clinicians. It needs to be feasible in their busy practice settings. And we need compensation, not just for the patient participants, but for the practices and for the clinicians. And lastly, it's really important that the findings that come out of the research are actionable and relevant. So it needs to be, the findings need to be able to be implemented back into the practice. And so those are the cornerstones of PBRN. So it's not mutually exclusive of what you presented or other clinical trials, but oftentimes those cornerstones are not met. So that's just, I just want to leave that as to answer your question of can we do it? And then also the appetite and how it might fit in.
Yeah, that's actually very encouraging and clarifying. So, I'll start at the last thing. I think it will be ultimately intrinsically actionable because it's going to dictate the treatment of a single patient in your practice. So that's, I mean, that's unusual because usually when you have a clinical trial, that's the reverse of what happens. In terms of payment, for the care, that's part of what the payer has to agree to. They wouldn't necessarily get a bonus, but they would at least have care for they would be reimbursed at their usual practice rates. Going to your first question about the IRB, we've worked with single IRB in our Tufts Health campus. IRB is willing to be a single IRB, but maybe you already have a single IRB up there. But it's obvious we don't want to go hospital by hospital or practice by practice. We need a single IRB. I mean, the good news is this is fairly benign. We're using all approved drugs for, reasonable purposes. But, I think it'll also be a practical matter because however attractive this sounds to practice, practitioners, I still see my own patients in a general medicine practice, and, you don't have infinite time. And so we have to systematize this in a way that really works in practices. And I think that'll require, not only input at the beginning from stakeholders, but continuous improvement and feedback. But ultimately, I think it's patient-centric. That's why it interested me as a clinician.
Thanks. Yeah, the N-of-1 trial definitely checks a lot of these boxes, and the things I was saying really can be applied to all clinical trial study design types. I'm curious, you said single IRB, so do you use a third party or are you able to use Tufts for?
Tufts is willing to do it as a single IRB for if we're an investigator. They don't market themselves, they're not like WERB or something. But if I run large clinical trials nationally, and when I do, they're available to use as a single IRB.
Oh, that's wonderful. So yeah, another consideration for this group and to participate would be either to, work with you with Tufts, and that would be great. Or make sure we have it in the budget for like Western or some third party, just current state.
Yeah. Well, I think the nice thing is probably it's a fairly low hurdle for most IRBs. But yes, I think we talked, a month or two ago, and I couldn't go to Attitash. I heard it was something bad happened there. But anyway, I very much would be willing to work with the Northern New England PBRN in this. But I want to be candid. We're just developing this, but it's a vision we have how to really integrate research into clinical care, which is our objective. Because right now, most clinical research is not representative of general care, and that's ridiculous. And it's not inclusive, it's not equitable, and it's not practical. And this is the objective here is to, have it used across the board and have generalizable clinical research and also benefit patients.
Harry, would Tufts charge for that service, or would it be a part?
I mean, they have some standard charges, but if this is, I haven't negotiated this specifically, but since I would, for the Tufts end of this, I would be the PI.
Yeah.
They're pretty, we work well together, I think. I don't anticipate that being a problem.
Yeah, I mean, I think Megan makes a really important point, and we're still, in the launching pad state. It's gotten off the ground. We have a, project that's going in where, we have 3 IRBs. We have Dartmouth, we have Maine, we have Vermont, and it makes it very complicated to have a single central IRB that worked with the PBRN. I mean, I think that has to go through the PBRN, but it sounds much more practical than what we could ever conceptualize for the practices based on where they're located.
Yeah, well, we've had a, we've already put this obviously through our IRB, and I think they're generalizing it to other sites, obviously using the reliance mechanism. I think it seems very practical to me. But I just can't speak for the IRB. David was once the chair of IRB, so maybe he could speak for it, but probably not, because every IRB, every session is different.
And the other
Well,
group that we might want to go ahead, and you might want to go ahead and consider bringing in is the UMass group, and they have their CTSA, but my reason for saying that is you could bring in Western Massachusetts and have the entire contiguous rural Northern New England group.
Yeah, well, we actually also have a presence in Western Mass for our CTSA.
That's right, I forgot about that.
Bay State Medical Center is also part of our CTSA.
Yes.
so, again, going back to the practicalities, and we're getting ending time. But something you and I should discuss, Harry, about having a reliance agreement between the 3 IRBs that cover our 3 states, and what Tufts does might be an option. But again, we'd have to talk with Megan and go through a lot of the processes, but.
Mhm. And community practices that don't have FWA, for example,
Right.
certainly hits the co-op.
Happy
Great.
to talk about that. I'm not the expert on IRB things. I generally, exactly, I just try to do what they tell me to do.
Well, thank you,
Okay.
everyone. We are a couple minutes over time. This was a wonderful talk, such a great discussion. Sheila will be back next time, and she will disseminate information on who we should expect. I don't have that information, but I'm looking forward to seeing you all. So thank you.